Welcome, everybody. I am Jeremy. I am the director of the honors program. So nice to be with you this evening and to welcome our guest of honor. I also want to just say hi to Luna, our student worker who is helping make sure on the back end the talk can run. Thank you, Luna, for holding up your end of the sky. And welcome to everyone this evening. Just briefly, I'm excited because this is our inaugural lecture for our Art and Politics lecture series, co-sponsored by the Honors Program at SVA and the BFA Visual and Critical Studies program, that asks about the relationship of art and politics in the face of kind of the many contemporary crises and disasters we face. Obviously, looking at anything from the continuing war unfolding in Gaza to what the hurricane that we're seeing in North Carolina to the election coming up to many, many more things. There's a lot of crises and significant moments, kind of significant turning points that we're seeing as a people in America, as a species, as human beings. And this lecture series aims to help us understand and confront and think through what comes next in the face of that. So really happy to have everybody here. We have an exciting full program this semester that I'll share in the chat in a few minutes. And at the end, I'll mention when our next lecture will come. So without further ado, though, I want to welcome Frances Fox Piven. Frances Fox Piven is it's hard to introduce her many accomplishments. I'll say what she recently told me first off, which is that she's about to turn 92 and has lived an incredible life on the movement as an author, as an activist, as a political scientist and an analyst, and as someone fighting for causes of justice in American society. She is she was one of the founding mothers of the National Welfare Rights Organization. She is a extremely, highly accomplished political scientist and activist. She is, I don't know if anyone else on this call can say they were largely or in some significant part responsible for a piece of legislation passing, but Frances was in part responsible for the Motor Voter Act, which made it so whenever you go to get a driver's license, you have to be offered the opportunity to vote at the DMV, the opportunity to register to vote. That is something Frances accomplished. And she's the author of many important works of political analysis and political thought, including Regulating the Poor, A History of the Welfare State with her husband and fellow analyst Richard Cloward, including Challenging Authority, How Ordinary People Change America, including Keeping Down the Black Vote, including Why Americans Don't Vote, and probably my personal favorite that I thought I'd bring out, Poor People's Movements, one of the great works on social movement theory as well as American social movement history. So that is a remarkable body of accomplishments. And we're so excited to welcome her here today to talk to us a little bit about the election coming up in America between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and the many things we can understand, the many things we can't understand, and how to make some sense of it all, and also have a space where people can ask questions and think together on what's coming up. So Frances is going to talk for a little while. She and I might bat things together a little bit, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A where people can raise hands or write stack in the chat to get involved. So without further ado, I will hand it to Frances. Thank you so much for being here, Frances.
Glad to be here again, Jeremy. And thanks for the introductory remarks. Everybody says, all my friends, all my colleagues say, we're at the cusp of a historic election in American history, the election of 2024. Everybody's kind of breathless about this election. We don't know what's going to happen. It is pretty much a neck and neck election. And everybody seems to agree that what's at stake in the election is American democracy. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm not going to solve the problem for you or for me of whether this election really is going to determine our future. I'm not sure. I don't know either, in other words, but I want to talk about what the themes in American political life are that are, in a sense, coming to a head, about to explode in this election and its aftermath. Let me begin by talking about that grand idea, that stirring idea, democracy. I think it is the greatest idea, political idea, that human beings have ever developed. It is so moving and so incredible in what it promises. The transformations that are possible if we have democracy, transformations of society and transformations of the state. Both are important and they're different. They're different. Democracy affects them differently. I want to talk about each in turn, not too long, don't worry. First, I want to talk about the bearing of democracy, of the idea that ordinary people have a say in the governance of our common life. How this idea affects government, the state. Think about the state. I think the best way to think about the state, to begin to think about the state, is probably to think about the English monarchy. When you first think about it, it's ridiculous, right? All that pomp and circumstance, the horse and carriage parades, the guys standing guard with those funny hats and those straps under their chin. What is that all about? It's about pretend, right? Pretend. Pretend to be special. Pretend to be different than other people, to be better than other people. Pretend to be aristocrats. Pretend to be a king, a queen. Pretend to have hereditary rights to property, to the making of the law, to the making of war, to the grabbing of land. That's the British state, but you know, there's something of this in every state, including even the American state, which was founded as the antithesis of the British state. The state is the embodiment of force and of pomp and circumstance and the majesty of the law. Democracy says, the burning heart of democracy says, we the people can constrain and influence and even control that state. That's part of the idea. The other part of the idea has to do not with the state itself, but with the societies. And our society, British society, actually all societies have always been very unequal. Wealth has been concentrated. Prestige has been concentrated. Certain kinds of authority have been that are social authority, not state authority, have also been concentrated. And democracy means not only that people influence the state, but that they influence that society. Often, it is by influencing the state that people can have some leverage on the character of society. But every democratic society has to cope with the fact that ordinary people want social conditions to be more equal. They want some of that property. They want some of that respect. They want some of that adulation. They want to share. They don't want to share actually enough by my sights, but people do want some of what's up there, some of what's up there. And the meaning of democracy has been not only to constrain the state with its control over armed force, the law, pomp and circumstance, but also to temper the inequalities of society. Now, I think that the idea of democracy, as it's developed, and it's always changing, and the history of those changes and the struggles that the idea and the changing idea led to has been thrilling. Thrilling. Just think about it. If you haven't thought about it before, if you haven't seen it before, what about the first time that you and your family and your village ever thought that the Duke or the Baron or even the King would have to be responsive to the will of the people? What an amazing idea. What an incredible, unbelievable idea. And it's an idea that has inspired people. It has led to the great revolutions that we talk about all the time. Most of them were not socialist revolutions. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, even the Russian Revolution was not exactly a socialist revolution. It was a manifold, it had many parts to it, many parts to it. And part of it was the aspiration for democracy, for constraining state power, and for limiting inequalities in society. Well, those aspirations of people have been fought not only in great revolutions, but they've been fought in little rebellions. They're fought all the time. People are always trying to be somebody, to have more to eat, to take care of their children. Those are the things that people care about and want. And those aspirations lead them into battle. So that, and they die for those battles. They die for those things. All of human history, or at least the history of the last few hundred years, has been dotted by those struggles. And people, we've won. Haven't we won? We do win. We win all the time. We win democratic gains. But we win over terrible resistance. And that resistance has led to modifications on the democratic ideal that are also that have also created the room for the corruption of the democratic ideal. Naturally, those who have more are against aspirations for equality. Naturally, those who are the privileged protected by the state or are in the state are against the aspirations of people to control the state. There's resistance. And that resistance has always taken advantage of the fact that democratic struggles are not fought in a classroom, in a village, on a street corner. They're fought in large societies that are big, that are complicated, and that the scale and complexity of society has influenced the way in which these conflicts have been resolved. The main system in which the resolutions are embodied are systems of what we call democratic representation. In other words, I'm a Democrat. I make friends with some of you. I don't like the way things are going at the School of Visual Arts. I think that some people have all the privileges and most of us do all the work. And anyway, we have to do what they say. We don't like that. We have other ideas. Maybe they're very good ideas. So we get together, we have a protest, we try to influence the authorities, we try to influence the donors to the School of Visual Arts. And in that process, there are concessions made, new arrangements are made, new systems are created. Democracy is not just me and my buddies hammering on the door and saying, let us in, be nicer to us, give us better grades. Democracy is us participating in an institutionalized system of representation. That's what elections are. They're an institutionalized system of representation that take account of the problems of scale and complexity that characterize modern societies, because we're not a village anymore. Those systems of representation, which are enormously complicated. Think about the United States. Not only do you have representation at every level, from the village to the town, to the municipality, to the county, to the state. Not only do you have all of that, but you have representation, different systems of representation for different kinds of issues. And different systems of representation for, in a sense, different kinds of citizens of less populated states are really in a different system of representation than states like New York or California, because they have, if you're from Wyoming, you have 2 senators and not hardly any people. Or at least that's my image of Wyoming. If you're from California, you have about 30 or 40 or 50 million people, and you also have 2 senators, right? That's a different system of representation. So those systems of representation be, become themselves the objects of democratic challenge and resistance. They're the focus of conflict between those who are in charge, those who have property, those who have land, those who have money, those who have the benefit of tradition, who have the benefit of established law, conflict between them and the people at the bottom who are making democratic challenges. We want some of that, they say. That's what they say all the time, isn't it? Yeah. So those battles are fought out often through the system of representation. You can see it happening right now. We're approaching what maybe everybody says it is the most important election of American history. And what is the fighting about? Well, it's about who gets to vote. For example, it's about how much trouble they have to go through to get to vote, what documentation they have to have. It's about who can harass them when they go to the polling place. It's about how their votes get counted. The system of representation itself creates opportunities for distortion to protect inequalities. There are also opportunities for distortion that result from the capacity of those who have more resources, more property, more money, more prestige, who are in favored positions in mass organizations. These people have the opportunities to create propaganda. They have the opportunity to call on, to create obfuscation, to hide what's happening from people. Do you think that happens a lot? Yeah, happens a lot. The complexity of government is in part a result of the effort to conceal government. Is that surprising? Of course not. Shouldn't be surprising. Or they can call on, what else? Religion. They can invoke the majesty and fear that is inherent in religion to keep people quiet. They can invoke nationalism. That's another, people seem to be very susceptible to appeals that are based on we have the same blood, or we come from the same village. We are the same. We're not the same, or we are all the same. Nobody knows which is true. But somebody is always invoking the idea that we are all one under this flag. And that also inhibits people from staking their own claims that reflect their own interests. Well, religion, nationalism, tradition, the inequalities that result from social life, the inequalities that result from control of the mechanisms of the state, they make democracy very hard to implement in practice. They make it very hard for ordinary people to control social life and to control the state. But there has been a kind of settlement in Western countries. What I mean by that is that we settle for something that's less than an ideal of democracy, but it's better than nothing. I'm not criticizing this. I agree. It's less than democracy and better than nothing. And the settlement that has prevailed in the United States and Western Europe, and that dominates political science thinking about elections and democracy, is that while people don't participate in the shaping of policy in any real way, what they do, what they can do, is they can come to an election every 2 years or every 4 years. And if they're unhappy, if they're uncomfortable, if the economy is going badly, they can vote the bastards out. That's the settlement. It's the settlement that American political science has accepted as the main way of interpreting electoral outcomes. It's a discomfort measure. Now, that's not the only thing we think of when we think about elections. We also think about crises. After all, everybody knows that the Great Depression had a lot to do with the election of 1932. Yeah. But the Great Depression created economic disaster. And so people did vote the bastards out. In a way, the Great Depression was the first discomfort election, you might say. So crises affect what people do in elections, but so do movements. In other words, people, masses of people get together. What is a movement? Masses of people get together, come together, and they may take to the streets. They may sit in at a factory. They may sit in at a school. They may badger local officials. They may have little marches. They may have big marches. So it's not just electoral representative procedures, but political scientists do recognize that crises and social movements like the abolitionists in the 19th century, movements like the labor movement of the 1930s, movements like the Black movement, the Black freedom movement of the 1950s and 60s. These also affect what happens in the struggle for democracy against those who are in established positions and who have property. However, what we also have to recognize, if we are going to take a historical perspective, is that not only those attractive movements like the abolitionists, the labor movement, the Black freedom movement, but there are also reactionary movements in American history, like the movement of Father Coughlin in the 1930s. Father Coughlin was a racist. He hated Catholics. No, he was a Catholic. I can't remember. He was steeped in prejudice. There was also the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, which arose in reaction to the abolition of slavery and the movement for Reconstruction. And then we have MAGA. MAGA is a very American right-wing movement. So is This election of 1924 that we look at and we worry about, is it just a repeat of our history? I think it is a repeat of our history, but it's not just a repeat of our history. I think something new is happening. I'm not sure I fully understand what's happening. However, people say, and I think there's truth to this, that it's a kind of crisis of democracy versus autocracy. On the one hand, over the last presidency, the Biden presidency, and we've seen a kind of revival of the New Deal and the Great Society. Are you aware of that? I mean, does it mean a lot to you? I'd like to hear that when we have our conversation, because it was a very big deal. And if you look at the history of policy, there were a lot of changes, especially in the last presidency. The child tax credit. I agree that these names that we give to new policies are not very evocative, but the child tax credit, had it been implemented, pretty much would have halved the number of poor people in the United States. Or we created paid family leave, something that people had been trying to accomplish for a long, long time. We became conscious of the housing shortage in the United States, and we even put a halt to one of the most miserable experiences that people ever have, short of jail, and that is eviction. For a brief time, in some states, we put a halt to evictions. We created childcare, expanded childcare. And even Donald Trump began to say he had concepts of a health plan, and everybody laughed correctly, because who knows what he meant. And then also there was something called the PRO Act, which had a whole array of labor reforms, which people had been working for and waiting for at least 10 years. So remarkable things happened recently, and they're on the table in this election. But on the other, think of the other there were other remarkable things that happened. We had leaders who began to talk about Orban and even Putin, the autocratic leaders of Hungary and the Soviet Union, as ideals for America. Incredible. A mysterious document called 2025, husbanded by the Heritage Foundation, was said to be the model for what the Republican Party, one of two major parties in the United States, we only have two, the Republican Party was going to promoting and was prepared to enact, it was said, 2025, which would strip Americans of certain personal liberties, not least the right to abortion, which would promote gun usage, which promised to deregulate the fossil fuel industry, creating the conditions for a climate disaster at the very moment when Hurricane Helene was killing people in the United States, Hurricane John 40 inches of rain fell in the province of Guerrero in Mexico. And at the same time, and this is what is the most interesting in a way, because it's so curious, it's the most interesting to me. We have the rise of what I think of as a strange performative politics. I mean, people always lie in politics, but they don't lie like the lies that are going on now, like Trump's lies or C.D. Vance's lies. These are too bizarre. They're so crazy. They're weird, as Tim Waltz would say. And then the shootings. What is that about? Why are people who were Trumpers in their recent past life shooting Donald Trump? And that's a performance, isn't it? They're getting up on stage and going, oh, boom, boom, boom. Or what about the electoral fantasies and stunts? I mean, I say fantasies because, there've been a lot of studies of something called electoral fraud. A lot of studies. It gets so boring. Electoral fraud, by that I mean fraud committed by voters. A lot of politicians commit fraud, that's true. But that's not what anybody is talking about in these performances about electoral fraud. They're talking about the fraud committed by voters. There is, compared to the number of votes that are cast, there is none. It's a complete fantasy. It doesn't exist. But politicians never stop talking about it. And not only do they talk about it, they pass laws to prevent it. They establish guards to prevent it. They spend money, lots of money in some cases, to prevent it. It's all fantasy. Everybody who knows anything about elections knows it's a fantasy. And it keeps dominating a lot of talk about elections. So, and then there are the cults. I don't think you can call them, I don't think the MAGA crowd is exactly a partisan group as we understood it. I know they're Republicans, I guess they're Republicans, but I also think they're cultists. And I think that these cultists account for much of the tone of the talk about our elections. That's new too. We've always had some cults, but this is big. This is lots of people and lots of important voices. Donald Trump is a very important voice, and he's a nut. He's a bad man, but he's also on the edge of sanity. So in all of these developments, which I think are new, before I call them the rise of performative politics, because nothing comes out of it. We don't have new laws as a result of all this carrying on. We don't have new institutions. We don't have new programs. People don't go to jail or they don't get out of jail as a result of them. Although a couple of people are going to jail because of the carrying on about elections. It's just, but mainly it's a performance. I don't know where it's going. I want to invite Jeremy to comment on my comments.
Uh, Thank you so much, Francis. I just wrote down about everything you said because I think it's full of insights, and I wish I immediately had a whole host of things to provide us like a definitive analysis. I think, you know, what you said about institutions and the way in which institutions produce a set of ways of translating supposedly the popular will into an outcome, and also our points of conflict, I think is like really remarkable. I was talking last night to someone from France, and he was just like, I don't think you Americans understand how bizarre it is that twice in recent memory the winner of your election, your presidential election, has not won, i.e., that there's a vote, there's a popular, everybody casts their ballot and someone wins the most votes, and yet the other candidate is the one that goes into office. And I think that's like, a bizarre fact of talking about American elections in general, that some of our institutional arrangements are quite outliers in the advanced world for the kinds of outcomes they produce, and that those outcomes seem to be more frequent. That the tension between our institutions and our society seems to be increasing over time. I've thought, and I wonder what you think, Francis. Like, I've wondered whether we have no more two-term presidents, that our politics is so unstable that it's just every 4 years now. It's going to be a new person, which is obviously very different from historical American norms. Um, so, anyways, that's a few thoughts on instability. I wonder, when you mention Biden, I wonder how much you think kind of it matters either way, that many of the policies you cited were part of Biden's agenda. They were part of his ambitions, but they were not actually accomplished because, again, largely of artifacts of the American political system, like the filibuster in the Senate, or other institutional mechanisms that prevent, even though the Democrats might have majorities in the House, might have supermajority in the Senate, and might have a president that says, here's my agenda, let's do it. Still, you might not see many of those things translate into policy.
I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I think that the accomplishments were nevertheless remarkable for in a short period of time by a politician who, to be perfectly honest, we had not looked to as a New Deal type leader. He was a kind of surprise. I didn't like him at all for most of his career, I have to say.
I wonder how you've also been thinking about, obviously, Biden's, now stepped down, and that was kind of another quite unprecedented moment. Again, not abnormal in the grand scheme of world elections. Like, the idea that an election only lasts 3 months or so is very normal in many parts of the world for how they do elections. But it's quite unprecedented that Harris is only, gets about 4 months to campaign in American history. Our elections throughout much of the 20th century are these years long affairs, so much money thrown in, a remarkable kind of lead up. It's basically, they say, well, try to get your policy done in your first year as president because the rest of your 3 years you're campaigning. So, it's also quite unprecedented. Biden stepping down, Harris stepping up. I wonder what you think about sort of the role of Gaza in that, and just the role of age and all sorts of things, like kind of again, that seems to be this kind of major shift, major new development in American history that makes me feel we're sitting on really unstable terrain.
I agree that we're sitting on unstable terrain and that Israel is very, very important in that instability. But I don't see the relationship with Biden's term or his policies. I don't understand why Biden was so indiscriminately supportive of Israel. I don't know why. I have no idea. I think it was a big mistake. That's my personal opinion. And I know it's a very difficult issue, a very sensitive issue, but I think Israeli policies are a disaster and promise to bring disaster to the whole Middle East. But that's another issue. That's not our conversation. Uh, I, a lot of things happened that were in a way different, couldn't be explained by precedents, but were they so unusual? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. I think that what is unusual is this election itself and the way in which the campaigns are unfolding. I think they're weird, as somebody said. Very, very different from American campaigns in the past. And I have to say, I'm especially astonished by the scale of the lying. Aren't you? I mean, do you know what it reminds me of? It was a story I used to like to tell. When Trump was campaigning, I think in 2022, he was just had a rally in Michigan. And he said to the crowd, to the MAGA crowd, "Aren't you thrilled by all the automobile plants I brought back to Michigan?" And the crowd cheered. Yay, yay. He didn't bring a single automobile plant back to Michigan, and they were in Michigan. Now, that strikes me as performative politics over the edge. It's really crazy.
Well, so who do you think is attracted to this performative politics? I mean, why does it
Everyone,
work?
well, not everyone, not you, not me. The MAGA crowd certainly is. And a lot of people who, politics is not interesting to a lot of people. They listen with half an ear. And it's complicated. And complicated things are boring. We are never going to solve the problem that politics, being an ideal democratic citizen, is such a pesty thing to have to do. We're not going to solve that problem. It's a problem for democracy. It's too boring and it's too complicated. I mean, that's for your philosophy class. I don't know what to do about that.
Um, Thank you, Francis. I see some people with questions already, so I think we should just open it up and if people wanna either you can use the little like raise hand icon or write as Tom has already done, stack in the chat and we'll put you in line to let's just have a conversation. Feel free to ask a question directly of Francis or if you have some thoughts, just, keep them brief so as many people as possible can participate. So
Jeremy, why don't you share the discussion?
happy to. Tom, go ahead.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you, Francis. I was really struck a moment ago when you talked about this election and this moment in American history as being a strange combination of what's both unusual and usual. And that put me in mind of what a number of journalists have written about the Trump phenomenon, is that what has been usual in American history is there have always been pockets of people on the extreme right. And so that's not different that we have those. What's unusual is that Trump, for a variety of circumstances, the apprentice program, celebrity and its value in the US, for a variety of reasons, Trump was able to sort of unite all of these, these pockets of far right extreme groups. And so that's unusual. But what's also unusual is that this might be one of the first times in American history where we've really had sort of a personality cult leader. And I'm really curious if you have any thoughts about, if the Democrats win this presidential election, what's left of the Republican Party, if anything, or what kind of politics do we have after the end of this, the downfall of this personality cult? Thank you.
I don't know. I really don't know. Maybe the Lincoln Project, but they don't have MAGA, and they don't seem to have a following. So Mitch McConnell, I mean, give me a break. That guy is going to be destroyed if the Republicans can't hold the Senate. I didn't say I knew. I said I was going to point to developments which are new, strange, and I may not be able to say much that's illuminating about them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Just one other, I recommend to people's attention. The New York Times had a podcast a couple weeks ago with a evangelical leader talking about, who had not wanted Trump to be the nominee and now was kind of coming behind and talking about his own thoughts about political strategy and Trump's backing away in certain ways from the most radical parts of the evangelical desires around abortion. And one thing he said that really struck me was he was just like, this, I think to Tom's point, he's just like, I've been around the Republican Party a long time, and I've never seen a personal following like that with Trump. Even Ronald Reagan, who was obviously a very special character and personality in Republican politics and history, just like doesn't hold a candle, doesn't compare to this guy. And I think we've seen that, in the Republican Party not really having a program anymore except for Trump. And, I mean, there's plenty to say about American parties having weak programs generally compared to many parties all over the world, but the Republicans really seem to have just entirely abandoned whole chunks of what it means to be a party, a political party, which goes to this question of who knows what comes next.
It's unnerving, of course, because there seem to be so many crazy people at loose in the country. But on the other hand, maybe it's also an opportunity. After all, Biden was president. What he did as president in policy terms was, I think, remarkable. Remarkable. And it isn't getting enough. We have to announce that. We have to say it because we want to build on it. We want to make the programs that weren't fully implemented, fully implemented. We want better programs. So we have to begin to talk about policy instead of talking about eating pets for dinner. I mean, what does that have to do with anything? Has to do with Haitians and the fact that maybe that Haitians were the first revolutionaries in the Western Hemisphere.
I'm gonna go to Kestrel. Go ahead, Kestrel, with your question.
Yeah. So, hi, thank you for your wonderful speech. And there is one question I have because we recently studied on the topic of whether an oligarchy exists in American history, and I think it's a interesting question to be linked to like the election you just talked about because you did. I wonder like if you have an opposite opinion to what the author of the article stated that democracy and oligarchy can coexist. That's my first question. And after that, I wonder, like, you did mention like a cult following of the election. Do you think like the cult, if the cult succeeded, will it have like make the oligarchical dominance worse?
I don't think that democracy and oligarchy are exactly opposites. I think we often say that call stable democracies point to oligarchies that make possible stable democracies because people accept oligarchical social arrangements. It's the challenge to oligarchy that produces stresses in democratic arrangements, I think. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, I think the idea, and this goes, I think, to what you were saying about the settlement too, that the American system relies on, especially as time has passed with things like, Citizens United, the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, and the kind of unlimited flowing of money into politics and other things. American democracy has taken on increasingly oligarchic characteristics, but it's also pretty obviously not correct to just say, you know, money wins an election. I mean, we saw actually with Trump that there were many deep-pocketed donors that didn't want Trump to be the candidate in 2016, in 2020, in 2024. It's complicated because there are other deep-pocketed donors who do want him to be that, and we should talk about the fossil fuel interests and a number of other things. But I do think that America has some complex mixture of some aspects of a democratic at life and mandate, and also that is the most of any democracy probably in the world, or at least any advanced democracy in the world, the most permeable by money and the most tending towards oligarchy. Those somehow all seem to be true at once.
I've actually been puzzled about the relationship between the group's basically big corporate interests that we usually think of as the movers in American society, the relationship between them and a buffoon like Trump. Don't they get impatient with it? Do they really want that kind of character spoiling what they're doing? After all, we can think about anecdotes like the role of Andrew Carnegie in an early 20th century depression. He called together the fat cats that he knew, and he assigned to each of them how much money they had to put into the stock market to prevent the fall, the collapse of the market. And they did it, and the market did not collapse. Somebody was in charge. Who's in charge? Surely not this guy, Trump. Could that be? And yet elsewhere in the world, you do have nutty monomaniacs in charge. But those are banana republics, not the United States of America.
Yeah, really great question, Kestrel. I'm going to go, Sana, you put a question in the chat. Why do you think there is such a denial of facts in history? For example, Trump's criminal charges, his early investigations with the Department of Justice, and his history of sexual misconduct. Why are far-right groups so quick to dismiss these?
Because it's in their interest to dismiss them. And besides that, they like loving Trump. It gives them some kind of satisfaction. The followers of a leader get satisfaction from following the leader. So they deny it. Trump teaches them how to do it. He just denies what's obviously the case. He just keeps lying and nothing happens.
I think like what I see a lot is like when I'm talking to people that are my age or especially children in high school, I will ask them about these things and especially with his history of sexual misconduct, and they'll quickly dismiss it as like that's his personal life or that's something that we should not have to worry about. Or if you ask them about for some reason people are very passionate about like border control and they're in defense of their argument, but when they'll always point to the statistics of criminals and rapists, all that sort of thing when discussing border patrol control. But then when you bring these up as like, oh, do you think someone of that history should be put into office? They'll say, of course not. But then when you say that Trump is along those lines, they'll completely dismiss that. I just wonder like why in whose best interest is it to dismiss such facts?
Well, it's obviously in the best interest of the person vying for power, but it's also in the interest of the believer, which, what can I say? The MAGA people they get satisfaction out of believing the lies they believe. If you go as an anthropologist to the coast of Louisiana and you spend time with the people who are in the communities that have been devastated by the oil industry and the oil deposits that have killed all the fish in the bayous, for example. These people do not get angry at their leaders. Their leaders are all they have. They cling desperately to the beliefs that led them to adopt those leaders and that seemed to create a life for them. This makes it very hard to be a community organizer or an enlightener, or you can't just tell people what to believe. You have to live with them and work with them and understand why they believe what they believe.
That makes a lot of sense, like the insistence to blindly follow. But I don't know if like it's hard for me to sit with the agree to disagree idea when if I'm trying to have a conversation with someone, most of it is colluded by like dismissal.
Most of it is created by what?
Dismissal of like any point I have gets quickly dismissed in that blind belief. So how are you supposed to communicate with someone if they're so devoted to delusion?
Well, it's not clear to me you always can, but you have to begin talking about things that you can both see and both assess and both make sense of. But that's true of your friends, that's true of your relatives too. You can't begin by arguing from somebody with somebody who comes from an alien community. You can't begin that way because they're going to shut you off or you're going to shut them off. It's my opinion.
Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic question, Sana. I see Caroline. Go ahead, Caroline.
Hi. I just wanted to talk a little bit about why people are easily swallowing what they're being handed. You talked about performative politics. I think that it has to do with the lack of critical thinking in our country. And I wonder if you agree with that. I recently heard that a professor or a dean at Rutgers University left his job because he wasn't being supported in promoting critical thinking. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, critical thinking seems to me to be very vague. I don't know exactly what people mean when they say that. I think that a lot of people are inclined to think of thoughts that make them more comfortable. Is that just Americans? I don't think so.
Mm.
I don't think so.
I think it's just laziness. I think that
Well,
people are really lazy. I don't think that they,
But you see, it's not just laziness, not just laziness. I remember talking to an undergraduate class a few years ago. I was giving a talk for the instructor who was a good friend of mine. And there was a woman sitting sort of directly in front of me. And for some reason, I fastened on her face. And I thought I could tell by looking at her face that there was a kind of anger in her face. And I thought the anger was at what I was saying. And the way I interpreted that, I never talked to her about it, and maybe I'm wrong, but the way I interpreted it was that what I was talking about was difficult for her to comprehend. I mean, it was not a first-rate school, it was a pretty poor school, and she was probably not very well educated. And I was just going on. And how did she react to that? I thought she reacted to it with anger. And I thought that was reasonable. It's reasonable for people to defend against interactions that make them feel so badly about themselves.
yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate.
Mm. Are
That's-
there, I see all these names on the screen. Are there faces behind the names that won't show themselves?
Well, we have a couple other questions in the chat already. Maria, do you want to
I did not have a question, but Caroline, I appreciate your mention of critical thinking, and I wanted to offer something that I read recently regarding student leadership and critical thinking, so very relevant to the college setting. I also lament that probably there's a lot of um blind sheep following, right? And following of the cult of personality because of a lack of critical thinking among people who maybe just give in to that comfort, as Francis said. So I wanted to offer that information that I saw from that recent article. And thank you, Francis. As always, I love attending your chats.
Listen, I want to say something about critical thinking that has absolutely nothing to do with the subject of my talk. But it has to do with the news today and yesterday about universities. I think that universities, I don't know if it's all of them, but leading universities in the United States are at this moment guilty of a major assault on academic standards and academic freedom. What is happening? I'm going to be 92 years old. I've never seen anything like this in my life. Columbia, Harvard, people are caving in to what I suspect are Jewish donors trying to exercise pressure on the universities to crack down on student speech and faculty speech that interferes with Israeli policies in Gaza and the West Bank. It's takes my breath away that this is happening, and I don't hear any screaming.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of cowardice on the part of many major universities to, stand by their students and that in fact, something like what Columbia did exacerbated the reasons students had to protest. It increased the sense that the university was not willing to listen to them at all, and many of them Jewish students, many of them, especially because there's quite a big generational divide among Jews in America on questions of their support or lack thereof for Israeli policy right now. And those students felt justifiably, with the intensity of the crackdown, alike maybe unto the 60s. I mean, I mentioned to a student earlier today that, there's a well-known photo of you, Francis, coming out of a window in Columbia University during the occupation of 1968. So in those moments, I think there had been like a level of intensity of repression, a feeling by university administrators and the like that letting the smallest sliver of student discontent out was going to topple the grand stature of the university, and they were very quick to repress.
Much more so now. Much
Yeah,
more.
that's fascinating. I see Valentine. Go ahead, Valentine.
I have a question regarding Trump's kind of cult identity and the rest of the Republican Party that is not attracted to his cult identity but still votes for him. Is this because they simply want to align themselves with the Republican Party still because it is their party, even though he doesn't share typical conservative Republican values? He's more of a populist. So are people simply voting for him, like the rest of the Republican Party? Are they simply voting for him because he represents their party, or do they, like, what do you think?
Well, I think that some people are voting for Trump just because he's a Republican, but the MAGA base, the enthusiastic base, is voting for him because he's Donald Trump, because of the right-wing populism, because of the lies, because of the performative politics. And that's new. That is new.
I actually have a follow-up question. What do you think the repercussions of this radicalization of the Republican Party will have on like the future of the Republican Party as a unified party?
The Republican Party may not survive this. I mean, look at the fractures that are already visible. They're serious. If they lose the Senate and they lose the presidency, we should all take a deep breath and fight to push the Democratic Party to the left.
And do you want to speak to that? I know, Francis, like, you know, I've had many different discussion with students, some student activists who, you know, have for various reasons, but I think maybe especially around foreign policy right now, some deep objections to the Democratic Party. And how do you think about navigating those things as someone who has had very different politics than many different, you know, probably every administration? I'm remembering at one point, Noam Chomsky in a recent interview, I think, was asked who was the best president of your lifetime. He was like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then the interviewer was like, who was the worst? And he's like, it's too hard to say. There's been so many bad ones. So I'm wondering, you know, how you think about that, how you think students should think about their voting, insofar as there, you know, that there are two candidates. There are really only two candidates in the American political system, and they, you know, have to decide: do I vote at all? Do I vote for which candidate? Like, how are there ways you think about that can be useful for students thinking through this?
Well, I'm always in favor of voting. You do the best you can with your vote, but I don't think that's the best way to do electoral politics, just by voting. I think movements have a huge impact on electoral politics. They create divisions where elected politicians are always trying to bridge divisions, or always trying to create coalitions. Movements work to raise issues, and by raising issues, they divide coalitions. And that's how we sometimes get progress. So I believe in electoral politics because I want to make trouble for electoral politics.
I love that. Tom, go ahead.
Thanks, Jeremy. I wanted to comment about, I think many of us are confused right now because we're looking for something that might help us out of the present predicament that we're in of modern politics in the United States. And so people reach for things like, well, critical thinking, if we had more critical thinking, or if we had more education. And I think those might help some, but I don't think they'll bring us any salvation. I think, and this isn't my idea, this is an idea of Jonathan Crary in his book, Scorched Earth. I think the biggest impediment for us in changing the politics we find ourselves in is that we live in a culture of immediacy, of the moment. And so we've lost any connection to history. And Francis, I was thinking of that, especially I grew up in Michigan. So, and I know the auto workers and the people in Michigan who, you know, 4 years later, they can forget quite easily that Trump didn't do anything. In fact, he damaged the situation when the auto companies were struggling so much in 2008. It's not because it's not just their willfulness in wanting to forget. I think that there are so many inducements these days. There's so much for our attention right now, right here, that what we're losing is being tethered to something in the past, some ideas about the past, some memories of the past. And so we become really weak agents in the present because we don't have any legacy that we bring with us.
I think there's truth in that, but I think we become weak because we don't do politics. Most of the time we don't do politics, and we don't work with other people to change our political environment, to make our own stamp on the world. When we do, and we feel it, we see what happens when we try to get what they promised us. We see how they react, and we see what we can, it changes us. We become political people, and I think political people have a better life, and they can leave the planet in a better position. I don't think the fossil fuel industry is run by political people. It's run by people who want to just stuff their mouths in their pockets.
Rosa?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about why you might think that about like third-party voters, people who say that they're not going to vote either candidate because they're both equal as bad. I wanted to see if you had like any insights as to why, if, even in like such a what we see as a important situation where if where for most of us the choice is obvious that you have to vote either one side or the other, why people might decide to, in a way, make their vote insignificant by voting a third party, knowing that it won't have a end result that's going to show itself. Well, that's not going to have a direct that their voter, the person that they voted for, isn't going to end up in office.
Well, I don't think that most of the people who vote for third parties think of themselves as wasting their votes. They think that Ralph Nader, if they vote for him, or Robert Kennedy, that idiot, they think that those are cleaner choices than the major parties have offered. They believe in their choices. So it's an argument. We have to tell them, explain to them, and they won't listen. They won't believe us that the third party vote is a wasted vote. And besides, Robert Kennedy is nuts.
So, thank you. I definitely didn't end up thinking about that.
I mean, one way I sometimes have of thinking about this too, because I teach philosophy, I'll put it in those terms here, but is the relationship between Kant and Hegel's ethical theories, which is that, Kant, who I agree with on many, many things about moral philosophy, but ultimately suggests that your will, like what you want to happen, whether you have the goodwill, whether you're doing a righteous thing in your own conception of what it is to do a righteous thing, that's what matters most. And Hegel suggests, well, actually, unless you have some sort of relationship between your goodwill and your ability to achieve that goodwill in the world, unless you're able to achieve the actuality of the good, then in fact your goodwill is in some sense an evil will, i.e. it separates itself from the world and suggests that it's okay for the world to be evil as long as I'm good. And I think that's, I don't know if I recommend talking to everyone when they're thinking about their voting in terms of Kant and Hegel, but I do think the question of morals and politics are very deeply related in every sense. The question is, in your own conception of doing the right thing, is it enough for you to do the right thing and let the outcome be what it will be? Or do you think that it's important to kind of take responsibility in part for the outcome as part of what it means to do the right thing? And that is like a sort of a difficult question that everyone should wrestle with themselves, I think.
I like that, Jeremy. Thank you for that.
Caroline is, go ahead, Caroline. Sana has a last question, and then I think we might wrap.
Hi, I just have a quick question. I'm not somebody who debates or is well spoken on politics. I love hearing other people speak about it. But I know how I feel about politics, and I try to encourage people to go out and vote and all those kinds of things. And right now I'm writing these postcards.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know if I'm making any difference or not. But one thing that strikes me funny is that there's some suggested copy to write on these postcards, and the first line of it is thanking people for being a voter. And it's so lame that I have to say that. But but if it encourages people to go out and vote, sure. But in your opinion, what is the best way to engage with people if you're not comfortable on a stage or, showing up at rallies or, having those conversations with people you either agree with or agree to disagree? Or
Well, you mean,
have you?
to engage in people to affect their behavior for this election?
Mhm.
Well, probably on the doors, probably
Okay.
knocking on their doors and having a conversation with them.
Mhm.
But over the longer term, the best way to engage with people is through a common project, whether it's to get a stoplight put on the corner or
Yeah.
bigger schoolyard but improve your community together and find out in that way who are the people who are against improving the community. And that's very illuminating.
And I will say, Caroline, I think writing postcards, insofar, I mean, I actually love receiving postcards, so maybe that's a personal thing, but also I will say, like, given that so many of contemporary elections are run, through a mass anonymous, like constant text, constant emails, that sort of thing, like the sense that there is another human being on the other side, a postcard, a knock on a door, a conversation, and as Francis is saying, in the deepest way, a connection. I do think those things kind of matter in knitting together some sort of civic fabric, which is badly frayed, and means of mass communication have helped fray that because, everyone is just constantly, whether it's television or radio or Twitter or whatever, there's just this anonymous broadcasting constantly, that I think goes to Tom's point too about that culture of immediacy, distraction, and the like.
Mhm. Thank you.
Sana, do you want to close us out?
Sure. I had a somewhat unrelated question. Like, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like what you think the implications of the recent assassination attempts are. Like, there was one recently at one of Harris's offices, and at the Gulf Resort, whatever, where Trump was, and then previously at like the rally. Do you think this has like any consequences for the future of American politics? Just because like in my lifetime, I had not seen something like this during election years. Or do you think this even has any implications for the future of control policy?
I think that it's bizarre though it is. And I don't mean to be applauding it, but it's another kind of performative politics. Both of the shooters were purportedly had been Trump supporters. Does that make any sense? Accepting that they wanted to get into the act. I mean, this is so crazy. I can't explain madness.
Yeah, it is a very mysterious. I mean, on the one hand, again, this goes to the usual and unusual too. I mean, it's true, as I mentioned in one of my classes, there is a Stephen Sondheim musical called Assassins, about all the assassins, and attempted assassinations of American presidents in American history. And that actually is quite an old tradition, obviously starting with Abraham Lincoln, but just about every 20 years, there's been either an assassination or an assassination attempt. So there is like, and then there wasn't for George W. Bush. He just had a shoe maybe thrown at him. But in a way, you could say, oh, this is a return to the norm. But on the other hand, there is something very bizarre and strange about it. And strange even how, I mean, I was recently in Long Island, and I saw flags had been made of the image with Trump, holding his fist up after the assassination attempt. But there was something obviously so performative and almost theatrical and ridiculous about seeing at the RNC people hold with the ear bandages, in solidarity, like something where nobody was taking it quite seriously.
And that fist gesture is if you want to fight, you go like, "Ugh." No. It's also weird, as Waltz would say.
Yeah, I find it so fascinating how it kind of became like another form of branding as opposed to like bring up a larger conversation on gun control. So I was hoping that it would be more hopeful, since both sides were affected, but I'm not so sure.
We
Yeah,
are going
thank
to find
you.
out, but I think we should not only find out, I think it is a moment to be politically engaged, not only in the election, but American politics is so unstable now that I think that small efforts, collective efforts, could have a big effect. So
think
that's good.
Great place to close. Yeah, that's a hopeful note. We'll take it.
I meant this talk to be at least half hopeful. I didn't mean it to be a downer.
I mean, in some ways, we'll see where we are in 2 months. I think all of us have some work to do, and there are many things to be quite worried about. On the other hand, there are reasons to feel a little more optimistic
Well,
about.
think of where we were a month ago. It's much better. It is. With Biden as the candidate, he clearly was not going to win. It made it so easy for this buffoon, Donald Trump. He's not only a buffoon, he is a bad man. He's evil. He's cruel. He likes watching people fight. A lot of human beings are like that. We don't want them leading the United States.
Well, thank you so much, Francis,
You
for
are.
your time. Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. My brief announcement, yeah, really just I feel like I'm going to be digesting so many of ideas we discussed here tonight for the next couple months in what I do, and I hope everyone here does that as well. Maria, I think, is just going to talk briefly about our voting registration opportunities. So Maria, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to put a brief plug. I can put it in the chat. If anyone wants to register to vote, still hasn't done it, needs consultation, we are here for you to help you through that entire process. We have physical forms for Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York. There is more information on the Student Affairs webpage, which I will put, including deadlines. But if you don't know where to start, we are happy to help so that you can at least get that bit done. There is online registration as an option. So we have researched all the deadlines and can help you out with that. But let us help you take that important step. And we're trying to work out an incentive program. It's still in the works, but if you sign up to be reminded to vote, there might be stickers. And I know how we all feel about stickers. So more about that coming very soon, but please reach out. We want to help everyone get ready and take that important step to register. Thank you, Jeremy, for the 5 minutes for that plug.
No,
Thank
thank
you.
you. And I bumped in the chat too, if you're a student who lives out of state and are curious about absentee ballot provision, Maria, as she said, Student Affairs can help. Also, there's a really nice website, canivote.org, which connects to the National Secretaries of State and can lead you very simply. You just put your state in. How do I get an absentee ballot? You still have time to do that for most states, but not so much time. So take a look at the website. And if you have any questions, I'm also happy to help on that. To Martha's question, yes, this is taped. It'll be up on the department YouTube probably in the next week or so, and I'll send out a link as a follow-up. And finally, just last plug is October the 28th is the next lecture in our lecture series. It's going to be is art history on the selected writings of art historian Svetlana Alpers, a new volume of her selected writings. So that's going to be at the SVA Theater, the big theater on 23rd Street. So please join us for that. And then there will be an election in November. And following that election, we'll have a little time to talk about a great work of critical theory called Prophets of Deceit, which in my view is still to this day maybe the most insightful book I've ever read at getting a sense of some of the aspects of some things we've discussed tonight, cults of personalities, irrationality in politics, where that might be coming from, ways in which you can have reactionary movements that are very also kind of rebellious and anti-authoritarian, but simultaneously authoritarian. Even stuff like they talk about how like, oh, in, certain authoritarian movements, they want a bulletproof martyr, someone who is both at the same time always suffering from persecution, but also bulletproof at the same time. Like a whole number of very, very insightful things in that book, Prophets of Deceit. So we'll have a lecture on that in November. I really recommend everyone pick it up and read it in the next few weeks also, because it just, I think, gives deep insights into kind of some of these far-right movements and how they operate. And it was written in the 40s, but feels like it could be written today. Which, that is true all over the world. And there are some signs of optimism like France, and there are some signs of pessimism like Austria had its largest vote for a party with roots in the Nazis yesterday. So this is a very unstable time in America and across the world. So thank you so much, Francis, for joining us and talking through this.
Thank you all. I enjoyed the discussion.
Have a great night, everybody.
Bye-bye.